Hello, today is January 27th, and today we're reading our gospel for this Sunday. Our gospel is Luke chapter 4, verses 21 through 30. Then Jesus began to say to all in the synagogue in Nazareth, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him, and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth. They said, "Is not this Joseph's son?" He said to them, "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say, 'Do here also in your hometown the things that we have heard you did at Capernaum.' And he said, 'Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in the prophet's hometown.' But the truth is, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when the heaven was shut up 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine over all the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except to a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. There were also many lepers in Israel at the time of the prophet Elisha, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. When they heard this, all in the synagogue were filled with rage. They got up, drove him out of the town, and led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. So our story this week is a continuation of last week's. That is, our story last week, our gospel at least, was Jesus's first public sermon, or first recorded sermon in Luke, in which he goes to his hometown, to his home synagogue in Nazareth, where everybody knows him. They know who his dad is, clearly. And he reads the passage from Isaiah 61. That the proclamation of good news to the poor, the year of the Lord's favor, release to the captives, freedom for the oppressed. Jesus reads this wonderful statement, basically putting forward his purpose, what Jesus is about. And he says, "Today these things have been fulfilled in your hearing." And they clearly respond pretty well to the initial message. Wow, that's an amazing thing. That's a beautiful message. And I'm sure as they are hearing this message, they are imagining the message is directly for them. That they are the ones receiving the blessing and the freedom that Isaiah is talking about. There is likely an assumption that they are in the in-group who is receiving the blessing that Isaiah is saying and that Jesus is promising them is being fulfilled today. And so that the initial part of this message goes pretty well. Jesus is kind of filling the role of the hometown boy that makes good. He clearly is fulfilling this role of wisdom, and the people of Nazareth, a town not well known for its wise leaders or as a particularly holy place, they are just so happy to give the scroll to the well-spoken son of Joseph. Here's the problem. Jesus then turns to them and says, this story, this promise, what Isaiah was talking about, it's not just about the people here in this synagogue. And when he says to them, in Elijah's time, in Elisha's time, the people who were open to the presence of God, the people who received the blessing of God, they were not in Israel. They were not in the people who are supposed to receive a blessing from God. They are not, there were lepers in Israel, but Elisha, he healed Naaman, a general of the Syrians. Elijah, he went and stayed and was sustained through a severe famine, not by a widow in Israel, not by a family in Israel, but in fact by a widow at Zarephath in Sidon, a Gentile, and one who was completely out of the bounds of someone who would be considered part of the in-group And so when you put that out there, when Jesus says, when Jesus puts those stories in the context of Isaiah, Jesus is saying, you think you are in the in-group. You think that that this promise is for you and for you exclusively. But I'm telling you that God has continually in the past, and that God will continue to give those blessings, to seek that relationship with people outside of who you would consider acceptable. God does not respect the boundaries that have been created here. Now, this story is not really about, as it sometimes has been preached, about the replacement of Israel, that Israel somehow has lost God's blessing or God's particular relationship. I also don't think it's entirely just about Nazareth. I don't think this story is entirely about the people of Nazareth feeling upset that they are suddenly not as comfortably recipients of God's blessing as they thought they were. I think this story, and the reason we have this story as the tipping off point in Luke, is that Luke is giving us the model of what Jesus' ministry is looking like. That Jesus is proclaiming freedom for others, and the people who would have previously assumed that the freedom and release and favor of the Lord is fit for them, they are upset to hear that freedom is being given to somebody else. They are upset to hear that blessing is being given to someone else. And so that's a curious thing. That's where we're getting into the psychology of blessing others. Abraham, the first person, the ancestor of Israel who had a particular relationship with God, in chapter 12, in Genesis 12, when Abraham receives these amazing promises, he is told he is blessed to be a blessing. That he is blessed so that other people outside of his family, outside of the nation of Israel, might receive a blessing too. And so, in some sense, Jesus is saying we have lost the plot if we have forgotten that. And for us, recipients, as the church, some 2,000 years after these events, we can hear this and say, well, of course, those people are upset. They didn't know that the blessing was for us. And every time we do that, every time we assert that the blessing, the freedom and release for the captives and good news to the poor is always for us, we have to remember that Jesus would always then amend and say, but really it's for them. But really it's for those who haven't gotten the good news yet. But really it's for those who you would not consider worthwhile. It's for those who you would consider beyond the pale. That the good news is not resting here, but it's moving on. And the people are in a rage because the hometown boy who was supposed to give them a comforting pep rally, a reminder that they are the beloved people, they are Israel, the people of Abraham who God had particularly blessed, they are hearing a message that the blessing is moving to others. And that is not necessarily bad news for them. It's not necessarily bad news for us to hear that God has favor and seeks relationship with people beside us. What Jesus is doing is he is pressing the issue and saying, you have to realize that you are not the center of God's concern. You are not the center of God's love. In some sense, this is a turning out of the message. This is a reminder that we are to as we receive the blessing, it immediately turns outside of us. Jesus is rejected in his hometown. They don't want to hear this. They don't want to hear anything other than praise and reminders that they are this special chosen people. But for us, we hear this and we are humbled and we are grateful. We are grateful that we are blessed to be a blessing. And like Jesus, we walk that path together. That is our gospel for this week. I hope you are having a good one. I hope you are staying warm. I hope you are staying healthy. Bye-bye.